444.M41. The hive world of Armageddon has been burning for months. A demonic incursion led by Angron, a Daemon Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons twisted by chaos into a thing of brass and rage, has torn through the world. Demons materialized from screaming wounds in reality. Entire hab-blocks were consumed by possessions that spread like fire through overcrowded spires. The sky bled colors that human optics weren't designed to process. Logan Grimnar, Great Wolf of the Space Wolves, their chapter master, a warrior with centuries of combat experience stretching back further than most Imperial worlds keep records, led his chapters part of the defense. His Space Wolves fought alongside Astra Militarum regiments drawn from Armageddon's own Steel Legion and beyond, grinding through demon-choked streets block by block. Angron was banished back into the warp. The hive world held. The surviving defenders, guard troopers who'd watched reality come apart at the seams, civilians who'd barricaded their families behind makeshift walls while demons shrieked in the corridors outside, had endured something that most citizens of the Imperium never encounter in a lifetime. They expected relief, medical convoys, perhaps even recognition. What dropped out of the warp was an inquisitorial fleet. The Inquisition didn't come to give commendations. It came because Imperial citizens now carried first-hand knowledge of demons, and in the Imperium's doctrinal framework, that knowledge is treated as a literal contagion. The Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to combating the demonic, classifies exposure to chaos as a vector for spiritual corruption. Every survivor on Armageddon, by this logic, was compromised. The guard regiments that had bled alongside Astartes against Angron's host were disarmed and processed for containment. Civilian populations that had endured a demonic siege found themselves rounded up by the same Imperium they'd just fought to preserve. Logan Grimnar watched soldiers who'd held the line against chaos being treated like contaminated material, and he did something that the Imperium's 10 millennia of psycho-conditioning, doctrinal enforcement, and hierarchical brutality are specifically designed to prevent. He refused to let it happen. Void shields on Space Wolves' warships hummed to full power. Battle barge reinforcements were called in from beyond the Armageddon system. The Great Wolf positioned his fleet in direct confrontation with the Inquisition's own vessels. One of the Imperium's supreme military commanders had trained his guns not on Xenos, not on Chaos, on the Imperium's own enforcers. The standoff that followed would be remembered as the months of shame. And precision matters here. Grimnar wasn't a rogue subordinate. He was the chapter master, the highest authority in his own chapter, and the imperial power he defied in this crisis was the Inquisition. The Imperium of Man spans over 1 million human-settled worlds, governed, if that word even applies, as a theocratic feudal autocracy. Its founder, the Emperor of Mankind, has been entombed on the golden throne of Terra for 10,000 years, sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, unable to speak or interact directly with anyone. His will is interpreted by the High Lords of Terra, the Senatorum Imperialis, a council of the most powerful officials in the galaxy. On their command, fleets cross the void. Only their edict can authorize a space marine founding. Their authority is functionally absolute. Below the High Lords, the Imperium maintains layered enforcement bodies that compete and overlap. The Inquisition possesses nearly unlimited authority to investigate, detain, and execute anyone suspected of heresy. The Ecclesiarchy enforces the imperial cult, the state religion that demands worship of the Emperor as a god across every compliant world. The Adeptus Arbites enforces the Lex Imperialis. These institutions share a single foundational axiom: obedience to the imperial hierarchy is the highest virtue a citizen of the Imperium can possess. Space Marines were built to exist outside this machinery, deliberately. When Primarch Robude Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, he was explicit in his reasoning. Space Marines exist to serve mankind, not to rule it. He structured chapters as autonomous military bodies, each commanded by a chapter master with centuries of battlefield experience, answerable to the broader imperial hierarchy in principle, but not subordinate to it in daily operation. Throughout 10,000 years of imperial history, very few Astartes have ever sat among the High Lords, and Guilliman designed it that way. That autonomy was supposed to prevent another Horus. A single Space Marine commander would never again have direct political authority over the Imperium itself. But it also created an unresolved structural problem. When a chapter disagrees with the Inquisition, it isn't a bureaucratic subordinate failing to process paperwork. It's a sovereign military power with battle barges, strike cruisers, and 1,000 warriors purpose-built for annihilation, choosing a different course. Space Marine disobedience is supposed to be rare, and chapters can punish it harshly. A Marine who breaks doctrine or command can be burdened with penance, exile, or a mission meant to kill him while redeeming his name. That matters because when disobedience produces victory, when it saves worlds or preserves the Imperium from threats its own bureaucracy failed to process, the system is forced to confront something it was never built to admit. The order may have been wrong. In a theocratic empire where institutional authority flows from divine mandate, admitting error doesn't just embarrass a commander. It undermines the metaphysical foundation the entire structure rests on. The Space Wolves were built to test that limit before it ever existed. Founded during the first founding from the gene seed of Primarch Leman Russ, the 6th Legion carries a reputation for independence that functions as institutional identity rather than personality quirk. Where the Ultramarines revere the Codex Astartes as something close to scripture, the Space Wolves follow their own warrior traditions rooted in the death world of Fenris, a planet of ice-locked continents and predators that make Catachan look mild. Their culture is shaped by saga and honor debt, by the mead hall and the blood oath, not by procedural regulation or doctrinal compliance. Their organizational structure reflects this. Great companies, each led by a wolf lord, answer to the Great Wolf, their chapter master, and beyond him, to the Allfather. That title is their name for the Emperor of mankind. Not the God Emperor, not the Divine Master of mankind. The Allfather, a Fenrisian honorific drawn from a belief system that predates the Imperial cult by thousands of years. To the Space Wolves, the Emperor is a figure of immense reverence, the creator, the warlord, the father who sired the Primarchs, but not a god. That distinction matters more than it appears. The Imperium's state religion demands recognition of the Emperor's divinity. The ecclesiarchy enforces this creed across 1,000,000 worlds, and the Adeptus Ministorum staffs the cathedrals, prints the prayer books, and trains the preachers who make it stick. Most Space Marine chapters handle this tension with quiet diplomacy. Their chaplains maintain veneration traditions that stop short of the ecclesiarchy's formal theology, a distinction too subtle for most imperial citizens to notice, and too politically delicate for the ecclesiarchy to press. The Space Wolves handle it with a 10,000-year-old dreadnought who sounds like grinding gears when he laughed. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is described in Imperial records as a venerable hero of immense power who has masterminded many of the Space Wolves' greatest victories. His body has been interred in a dreadnought sarcophagus for over 10 millennia, a walking tomb of ceramite and adamantium, kept in stasis between conflicts, roused only when the chapter faces existential threat or requires his counsel. He is the last living being in the Imperium who fought alongside Leman Russ himself. He walked the galaxy before the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne. The Primarch still drew breath. In Aaron Dembski-Bowden's novel, The Emperor's Gift, Bjorn is confronted by representatives of the Inquisition during a period of acute institutional tension. His response comes through augmetic speakers older than most planetary civilizations. God Emperor? Calling him a god was how all this mess started. A Grey Knight narrator in the same novel makes the broader Astartes point plainly. Few chapters regarded the Emperor as a god, seeing that belief as something common among the masses they were sworn to protect. This is the culture that forged Logan Grimnar, a chapter built on the conviction that the Emperor was the greatest human who ever lived, creator, conqueror, father, but never divine. And if the Emperor wasn't a god, then the institutions claiming divine authority to act in his name were operating on a foundation they'd constructed themselves, not one he'd endorsed. The first war for Armageddon in 444 M41 was the event where that conviction met the defense had been a grinding horror. Angron's demonic host didn't fight like a conventional army. Demons erupted inside fortifications. The fabric of reality itself seemed to fray above the hive spires. Guard troopers held firing lines against creatures that defied ordinary battlefield logic, while the space wolves hacked through them in brutal close-quarters fighting. The victory was real. Angron was banished. The demon host collapsed. Armageddon survived. The Inquisition's response was also, within its own framework, rational. The Ordo Malleus had spent millennia developing doctrine around demonic contamination. Knowledge of demons can attract demonic attention. Populations exposed to warp incursions carry, in inquisitorial risk models, an elevated probability of corruption, cult formation, and psychic instability. The standard protocol for a major demonic engagement was containment. Relocate the population, quarantine the contaminated, ensure that knowledge of what actually happened never reaches the broader Imperium. On Armageddon, that protocol meant treating the survivors of a demonic invasion, soldiers and civilians who had held the line for the Emperor, as liabilities to be processed. Guard regiments were stripped of their weapons. Whole populations were herded into processing camps. The specifics varied, but mercy wasn't the point. Logan Grimnar had fought beside those soldiers. His space wolves had bled alongside those guard regiments in the streets of Armageddon's hive cities. He watched the Inquisition move against people who had earned the Imperium's gratitude and received its suspicion instead, and he determined that whatever authority the Inquisition claimed, it didn't extend to this. His refusal wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't channeled through protest or formal objection. He ordered void shields raised. He called in battle barge reinforcements. He positioned his fleet in weapons range of inquisitorial vessels and made the calculation explicit. If the Inquisition wanted to continue its containment operations, it would do so over Space Wolves' guns. The Inquisition didn't back down easily. The confrontation threatened to spill from a post-war purge into outright bloodshed between Imperial forces. The crisis also drew in the weight of the Space Wolves' own history. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the ancient dreadnought who had fought beside Leman Russ, embodied a memory older than most Imperial institutions. His presence underscored what the Inquisition was dealing with. Not a wayward officer, but one of the oldest and proudest chapters in the Imperium. The months of shame ended without open war between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition. But the resolution wasn't reconciliation. The Inquisition didn't forget. The Space Wolves didn't apologize. The institutional apparatus of the Imperium was left holding a result it couldn't comfortably acknowledge. A chapter master had defied Imperial enforcement authority, backed his refusal with capital ship firepower, and walked away intact. The reason is structural. The Space Wolves are a first founding chapter, direct inheritors of the Emperor's genetic legacy through Leman Russ, one of only a handful of chapters that can trace an unbroken lineage to the Great Crusade itself. Their military strength includes battle barges, strike cruisers, and a full 1,000 transhuman warriors bred on one of the most lethal recruitment worlds in the galaxy. Their symbolic weight across the Imperium is immense. Sanctioning the Space Wolves would cost the Imperium one of its most capable fighting forces during an era when every sector faced active threats from chaos, orcs, tyrannids, or worse. It would also broadcast a message to every other chapter watching. The Imperium values bureaucratic compliance above battlefield results. The High Lords couldn't afford that message. The Inquisition couldn't enforce its will against a power it wasn't equipped to defeat. Grimnar's defiance survived because he stood at the apex of his chapter's hierarchy and commanded the firepower to make his convictions politically expensive to overrule. Uriel Ventress, an Ultramarines captain, had none of those advantages. and his story shows what happens when the same impulse toward independent judgment meets an institution from the inside. The Ultramarines are the most codex-adherent chapter in Imperial history. Founded by Guilliman himself, they treat the Codex Astartes as something between tactical gospel and philosophical constitution. Deviation from Codex doctrine within the Ultramarines isn't merely a tactical error, it's a rejection of their Primarch's vision for how Astartes should wage war. For a captain of the Ultramarines to break that doctrine is an act of institutional heresy against the chapter's foundational identity. Ventress broke doctrine. The consequence, in the material we have, is unambiguous. The Ultramarines sentenced him to a death oath. He was cast into the Eye of Terror, the permanent warp rift where the barrier between reality and the Imperium has collapsed entirely, with a mission to destroy the daemon-choked, a nightmarish chaos creation involving forced breeding of corrupted flesh to produce new Chaos Space Marines. A death oath is the chapter's way of solving two problems at once. If the Marine dies, the sentence is carried out. If the Marine survives, the chapter can frame the ordeal as penance completed rather than punishment that failed. Ventress survived. He destroyed the daemon-choked. He walked out of the Eye of Terror and returned to Ultramar, a feat that lends weight to the idea that whatever instinct drove him to deviate from doctrine wasn't recklessness, but judgment. His case mirrors Grimnar's from the opposite direction. Grimnar challenged an external institution from a position of overwhelming strength. Ventress was punished by his own chapter from a position of total vulnerability. Both survived. Both, in different ways, exposed the same structural fault. The Imperium's mechanisms for enforcing obedience crack when the disobedient warrior turns out to have been effective. Every one of these confrontations circles the same question that the Imperium was specifically constructed to prevent anyone from asking. What did the Emperor actually want? The Emperor, who walked among humanity during the Great Crusade, rejected worship. He championed reason, science, the secular advancement of the species. He created the Space Marines to serve and protect mankind, not to police billions into terrified submission. The institutions that claimed to carry his mandate in the 41st millennium enforced the worship of a man who explicitly refused to be worshipped. The Inquisition enforces ignorance in the name of a ruler who valued knowledge and built an empire on its expansion. The bureaucracy punishes deviation from procedures the Emperor never authored, reading his silence from the Golden Throne as endorsement of whatever the current power structure demands. When Rabute Guilliman was resurrected in the closing years of M41, the first Primarch to walk among men in 10 millennia, now Lord Commander of the Imperium, Imperial Regent, and Lord Militant of the High 12, he looked upon what his father's dream had become. His verdict was recorded in Imperial histories with the clinical detachment of a man who had lost the capacity for surprise. Why do I still live? What more do you want from me? I gave everything I had to you, to them. Look what they've made of our dream. This bloated, rotting carcass of an empire is driven not by reason and hope, but by fear, hate, and ignorance. Better that we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than lived to see this. Rabute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent, standing in the heart of Terra and declaring the entire edifice a corruption of its original purpose. Logan Grimnar reached a similar conclusion, 10,000 years into the Imperium's decay, without a Primarch's authority or perspective. He reached it standing over the survivors of Armageddon, while the Inquisition classified their suffering as a security risk. He reached it watching soldiers who'd held the line against Angron's demon host being processed like contaminated equipment. The institution claiming to act in the Emperor's name was punishing the people who'd just fought for it, and Grimnar decided that whatever authority that institution held, it didn't extend to betraying the warriors it owed its survival to. He happened to command a fleet powerful enough to make that decision stick. That's the part the Imperium has never solved. Its warriors are trained to obey. Its institutions depend on unquestioning compliance to function across 1,000,000 worlds. And yet the defenders who actually save the Imperium from annihilation, the commanders who hold the line when reality tears apart and demons pour through the gap, are often the same ones who decide that the order they've been given is wrong and act on their own conscience instead. Grimnar defied the Inquisition after Armageddon and preserved the honor of warriors who'd bled for the Emperor. Ventress defied Ultramarines' doctrine and walked back from the Eye of Terror, carrying proof that his judgment had been sound. If you're looking for the clearest single case here, it's Logan Grimnar during the Months of Shame. Not a Marine defying his own chapter master or the High Lords directly, but a chapter master defying Imperial authority and proving too powerful to punish. The Imperium preaches obedience above all else, but victory is the only pardon it actually respects, and strength is the only thing that keeps a righteous refusal from becoming a death sentence. The warriors who grasp both truths, who refuse the wrong order, challenge the wrong doctrine, and point their guns at the wrong inquisitor, aren't dangerous because they lack loyalty. They are dangerous because they prove the institution can be wrong. And the Imperium has never figured out what to do with a warrior who is both disobedient and correct, except to let him keep fighting and hope that next time, the order and the right thing will finally align. 10,000 years in, they still haven't. Subscribe for more stories from the 41st millennium.